Chapter 31. A friendly consultation. A dangerous embassy. Lady Clarissa receives some disagreeable intelligence. An awkward contest. Unpleasant visions. A fitting termination to the confidential union between master and man. Such was the state of affairs in the bedroom of Sir Matthew Dowling when Dr. Crockley entered it. Were all the were were all the words which Mrs. Gabberly then uttered in explanation of what she had done, why she had done it, and how her doings had answered, to be written down here, my waning pages would hardly suffice to contain them. Dr. Crockley nodded, winked, approved, and applauded a great deal, joked a little, and finally felt the patient's pulse, observing at the same time that it was necessary at any rate to bring him round sufficiently to get a little talk on business out of him before he popped off for good and all. "Very right and proper, if you can manage it, doctor," sagaciously observed Mrs. Gabberly. "But if you may depend upon it that—" and here she whispered something that was especially intended Martha should neither the better nor worse neither the better or the worse for. The doctor nodded and winked and nodded again, and then turning to the poor girl, who was not only the one who alone in that presence cared anything for the prostrate millocrat, but the one of all created beings who alone have felt his death to be a cause of mourning, would alone have felt his death to be a cause of mourning. Dr. Crockley turned to her, and with very little of even the external decency of sympathy said, "Do you think you can manage to get some mustard, my dear, out of the clutches of the bailiffs? Because that is what we want here." Without answering, Martha moved towards the door, and Michael, not conceiving that the physician's words were but a brutal jest, and fancying that Martha might really have to petition those who now held authority in the household for the article wanted, stepped after her to request that he might execute the commission in her place. "You shall come down with me, Michael," she replied, "and I doubt not that you will be able to procure what we want without difficulty. But alas, Michael, it will avail nothing. I am sure by their whispering that they both know it will avail nothing. Nevertheless, it shall be tried. Is it not dreadful that of all his numerous family there should be only one to receive his dying breath? O God," she added, with clasped hands and streaming eyes, "if it be a judgment, let it atone for all that has been wrong, for surely it is a heavy one." On reaching the hall, the pitying Michael, who in the sufferings of his friend forgot all the cruelty of his enemy, insisted upon going alone into the throng and noisy offices, while she sat down waiting for his return. He did his errand promptly, and was by her side again in a minute or two, but found that she had left the chair on which he had placed her, and was now pacing up and down the hall in violent agitation. "I'm overpowered! I'm borne down by all this horror, this deep and bitter grief!" she exclaimed. "There is not a single human being near me but your ill-used self, Michael, whom I am likely to find any real kindness. The conduct of all with whom I have had any intercourse since my poor father's distresses came upon him has been such as to make me wish rather to shun than seek them at this awful moment. Yet I want some one to tell me how I ought to act. I know that fearful man Parsons, who is greatly in his confidence, has business of importance to settle with him, for again and again my father has said to me, since the execution has been in the house, that let what would happen, he must find time to speak to him. Ought I not then send to him in this extremity?" "Would to heaven I were fitter to advise you, my dear Martha," replied Michael, with equal respect and tenderness. "Certainly, if such were your father's words, it is very right to remember them. Shall I go to the factory and summon Mr. Parsons hither?" "Oh, it is hateful to me," replied poor Martha, "to call such a being to his deathbed. But it may be that the interests of others are at stake, and when I recall my father's earnestness as he spoke of the necessity of seeing him, I tremble at the idea of disobeying him. Go then, Michael, hasten to the factory, and tell this man that his master is very ill, but that if he recovers his senses and his speech, it is probable he may wish to speak to him." Michael lost no time in obeying her, and on reaching the mills found the superintendent as usual at his post. At first glance he did not recognize the messenger, for the appearance of the young man was greatly changed by the style of equipment which, under advice of Mr. Bell, had been provided for him. No sooner did Michael speak, however, than the man started, as if he had been shot. "Sir Matthew sent you?" he exclaimed. What mountebank tricks have you got at now, you young villain? What, did you think that this fine toggery could bamboozle me? Has it really bamboozled him? Have you, faith and troth, contrived to pass yourself off upon your dearly beloved benefactor as a gentleman of fashion and fortune who has come to make him a visit of condolences upon his misfortunes? A capital fellow, ain't you? Or, perhaps, my nice young grandee, you fancy his grinders are drawn, and that he can't, or won't, maybe, have anything to do, now that he has fallen into trouble, with putting such an elegant young gentleman to inconvenience. Is that it? But is it just possible that other people may be more at leisure? Who knows? Never mind me now, Mr. Parsons, replied Michael, utterly indifferent at that moment to anything and everything that his old enemy might attempt for the purpose of annoying him. Never think of me or my affairs at such a time as this. You have given me no opportunity to speak, or you would have understood that it was not Sir Matthew who sent me here, but his daughter. Sir Matthew was too ill, when I left the house, to know anything about it, but Miss Martha thinks that, if he recovers his speech and senses, he may wish to speak to you. Like enough, replied the superintendent with a sneer. Sir Matthew's troubles have nowise changed his nature. The young lady is quite right, but I shouldn't have thought as he'd have told her anything about it either. But what she might approve the job too, if she got any spirit in her. But she is but a poor, pooling sort of creature, much as she was when she used to cosset you, my beautiful master runaway apprentice. However, never mind that now, as you say, my pretty master. There's a time for all things. You may just step in here while I change my coat, and it bean't the first time as you have entered this pleasant building, Master Mike, is it? Michael was going to obey him, but at the moment he was about to pass the threshold, something in the eye of the superintendent made him pause. He recollected full well the ready lock of that once hated door, and it struck him, as by no means impossible, that his old acquaintance might turn it upon him if he put it in his power to do so. Fears for his own personal safety he certainly had none, being quite aware that he was no longer in danger of being kidnapped as heretofore. But the idea of Martha being left at this her utmost need, in want of any little service he could afford, was quite enough to make him cautious, and with something of an involuntary smile he stepped back, saying, "There is no occasion for me to wait for you, Mr. Parsons. I have delivered my message, and you may obey it or not, as you please. At any rate, you cannot want me to show you the way to Dowling Lodge." And so saying, he turned round and walked out of the yard. "Pestilent young viper!" muttered the superintendent between his closed teeth, "that I should live to see him strut off before me in that fashion. But I'll have to try if I can't plague him yet. Fool that I was, when I had him snug by myself on Ridgetop Moor, not to give him one farewell thrashing with a horsewhip. If I had put a joint out or two, it would have been no great matter, and then I should have been spared the damned sight of him now, marching off, hang him, like a peacock before me. As to changing my coat, that's fudge. People don't trouble themselves to change their coats when they're going to pay their compliments to an apoplectic bankrupt." Having fairly got beyond all the bolts and bars immediately within the jurisdiction of Mr. Parsons, Michael slackened his pace, being rather inclined to have the society of his former tyrant than not. "Sir Matthew appears to be in a very dangerous state, Mr. Parsons," said he, as soon as the sulky superintendent came up to him. "Perhaps your right honourable greatness has been studying medicine since I had the pleasure of taking that little drive with you into Derbyshire." "I've studied many things since that time, Mr. Parsons," replied Michael, laughing. One is the nature and use of locks." The tone which this was answered was so brutal that the young man, rather from disgust than anger, walked on faster than his foe could follow him, and reaching the house some minutes before him, made his way again without ceremony, for it was no time for it, into the apartment of Sir Matthew. A considerable change had taken place in the condition of the patient since he left it. The cataplasms had so far succeeded as to restore animation and consciousness. Sir Matthew, still surrounded by Martha, Mrs. Gabberly, and the doctor, was gazing upon them with widely opened eyes, which, though wild and wandering in expression, were evidently not devoid of speculation. Michael had entered very gently, but not without being heard by the sick man, for he turned his eyes full upon him as he approached. The sight of him, however, no longer seemed to produce any emotion. for after looking quietly at him for a moment, Sir Matthew turned his gaze upon Mrs. Gabberly, who, from being in the act of leaning over him, brought herself particularly within his sight. "Is Parsons come?" said Martha in a whisper. He must be in the hall by this time," replied Michael. "Shall I tell him to come up?" "My dear father has not yet spoken," she said, "but perhaps he may understand me. Parsons is here, papa," she added, taking her father's hand, and leaning over him. "Should you like to see him?" "He is in London, my dear," replied the knight very distinctly. "Thank God!" exclaimed Martha, tenderly kissing him. "Thank God! His speech is not at the least affected." "Rather wandering, though," said Dr. Crockley, winking his eye at Mrs. Gabberly. "I say we should bleed him again, if you want to get anything out of him," observed Mrs. Gabberly, looking sagaciously at the doctor. "Perhaps I may, in an hour or two," he replied, applying his finger to the patient's pulse. Sir Matthew fixed his eyes upon him, and laughed a horrid, rattling, ghastly sort of laugh, that seemed to come from his throat. "You haven't quite done with me yet, have you, Crockley?" said he. "Done with you, my dear friend? God forbid!" replied the physician, rather startled at the apparent healthy state of his patient's intellect, and affectionately smoothing his pillows and settling the bedclothes about him. "Would you like to see Parsons, dear papa?" said mamma. "Would you like to see Parsons, dear papa?" said Martha, gently, and again bending over him. "Oh, yes," he replied eagerly. "I'll see Parsons now directly. I should very, very sorry not to see Parsons. I may live, or I may die, you know, but I must see Parsons."